Okay, in this section, we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by taking the square root. Sometimes I'll just say this is solving quadratics like a regular equation. So we're going to start with the really super easy problem to begin with. We just have the square root of or x squared equals 81. And so the opposite of x squared is the square root of x. So these two operations are inverses. Squaring something multiplies it by itself, whereas taking the square root says what times itself gives me this value. So to get rid of a square root in an equation, we just square root both sides. But when we square root both sides here, we're going to have x over here. The square root cancels out the square. And over here we will get 9. However, 9 is not the only answer to this problem. Because if I do 9, well, if I do 9 squared, that will give me 81. But there is another number that would also give us 81. If I did negative 9 squared, then negative 9 times negative 9 is going to be negative times negative is positive 81. So positive 9 is an answer, but negative 9 is an answer as well. A lot of these problems that we're going to do are going to have two answers, and actually towards the end we'll look at how we can tell whether or not there'll be two answers or not. One way you'll sometimes see these answers written also is instead of writing just 9 and negative 9, you might see it written like this, x equals plus or minus 9. So you can write it like that as well. Whenever you square root both sides of the equation, you have to put a positive and negative with your answer because both are answers. So let's look at the next equation that we've got here. We've got 5x squared equals 25. Now this one's a little bit different because notice over here on this side of the equation, we've got this 5 right here that we have to get rid of before we can worry about the square root. The square is the last thing that we're going to deal with in a lot of these cases. So for this problem, we would need to divide both sides by 5 first. And whenever we do that, we're going to get x squared equals 5. And now we need to get rid of that square root. So we're going to have to, that square, so we'll have to square root both sides. Sorry for the mistake there. And so whenever we square root x squared, we get x. And over here, we cannot take the square root of 5 evenly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it the square root of 5. I can't break that down or simplify it, but I'm just going to put square root of 5. And since I took the square root of both sides, I'm going to put a plus or a minus here. Don't forget that plus or minus when you square root both sides, because that tells us that we could have positive square root of 5 or negative square root of 5. We're just going to leave our answer like this. You could get a decimal for that answer, but I'd really rather have this answer, which is what we call an exact answer. Okay, so let's look at our next example. Here we've got x squared plus 8 equals 24. So just like solving a regular equation, a linear equation where we don't have the square, we want to get that x by itself. So to get that x by itself, first thing we need to do is we need to subtract 8 from both sides of the equation. And so if we subtract 8 from both sides of the equation, it cancels out over here. We're just left with x squared. But over here, we were going to have 24 minus 8, which is going to give us 16. And now we just have that square we've got to get rid of. So we're going to square root both sides of the equation. And when we square root both sides of the equation, we get x equals 4. But we took the square root of both sides of the equation, so we have to put a plus or minus there in front of that 4. So this is our answer. We've actually got two answers, positive 4 and negative 4. Okay. For our next one, this one's getting a little bit more complicated. We've got 9x squared minus 24 equals 57. So I'm going to draw this line right here. We want to get that x right there. We're getting that x right there by itself. So in order to do that, we've got to get rid of this 24 first. So we're going to add 24 to both sides. So we're going to add 24 there on both sides. 24 will cancel over here, just leaving us with 9x squared. And then over here, we're going to have, let's see, 7 plus 4 will give us 1. And then we'll get 81 right here. Now, the square is the last thing we're going to deal with on this one, so we need to divide off that 9 first. So if we divide both sides by 9, we get x squared equals 9. 81 divided by 9 is 9 there. And then so last thing, we've got to square root both sides, and thankfully this is something we can take the square root of. So x is going to equal plus or minus 3. So we've got two answers there, positive 3 and negative 3. Okay. Here's our next one. Now this one is a little bit different than the ones that we have done so far, because we've got, for example 5, we've got x plus 1 squared equals 64. Now so right here, that square is on the outside of that parentheses, and we cannot do anything with this equation until we get rid of that square. So this one, we're actually going to square root both sides first. We can't subtract that 1 because it's on the inside of the parentheses. So if we take the square root of both sides, we will have x plus 1 on this side, because the square and the square root cancel each other out. And over here, we are going to get 8. But we must remember that is a plus or minus 8. So what we've really got here is we've got two equations. We've got x plus 1 could equal positive 8, or x plus 1 could also equal negative 8. The big mistake students make here is they forget to put that plus or minus and split this up. So I can, over here, x plus 1 equals 8, so I could subtract 1 from both sides. So x would equal 7. That's one of my possible answers. Or over here, I could subtract 1 from both sides, and x would equal negative 9. Negative 8 minus 1 gives us negative 9. So that's my other answer. So I've got two answers here, 7 and negative 9. Okay. Let's do another one a little bit like that. This has got even one more step here. We're going to subtract this 3 first to get rid of it. We can do that very easily. So we get x minus 4 squared left on this side. The 3's cancel there. And over here we just get a 1. Now we need to square root both sides, because we've got to do what's on the outside part first. We've got to get rid of that square. So that's going to give us x minus 4 equals, the square root of 1 is 1, but we must put a plus or minus there. So we will have two separate equations here. We'll have x minus 4 equals positive 1, or x minus 4 could also equal negative 1. And so when we do that, we can add 4 to both sides here. And so x will equal 5. That's one of our equations. And then we have the plus 4 and the plus 4 over here. And so x equals 3 right here. So you've got two answers, the 5 and the 3 for this problem. Okay, let's do just a couple more things here. One thing you need to know whenever you're doing these problems is that you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So if you get a problem like example 7, if I'm solving this equation, I would subtract 8 from both sides. And when I do that, I would have a 3x squared left on that left-hand side. And over here, I'd have a negative 3. 5 minus 8 would give me negative 3. And then I would divide this 3 to get rid of it. And so x squared would equal negative 1. Here's our problem. Whenever I go to square root both sides of this, I'm trying to take the square root of negative 1. There is no square root of negative 1, because square root means what number times itself gives us this value. There is no number times itself that will give us negative 1, because any number times itself is always positive. If I have negative 1 times negative 1, that would be positive 1. So -1 won't work here. Also, +1 won't work. So this tells us when we have to take a square root of a negative number, this tells us that the answer would be no real solutions. Okay, so there are no real solutions for this. Also, you may run into some problems that look a little bit like this. Now, this problem is a little bit different than the ones we've done before. This one, notice the square is not on the outside of these parentheses. So what we want to do here is distribute that 5. And so that will give us 5x squared plus 40 equals 40. Okay, so now we could subtract 40. All right, so we subtract 40 from both sides. Now what happens here is it cancels on both sides. Now, a lot of students will put that this is no real solution for this, but that is not correct. Now, when this cancels, 40 minus 40 is 0, so we have to put a 0 here. So now we can divide both sides by 5, and 0 divided by 5 is going to be 0, so x squared equals 0. And we will square root both sides. And so when we square root both sides, we get x equals plus or minus 0. But in this case, it really doesn't make sense to put a plus or minus 0 because 0 is neither positive nor negative, so it does not have a sign. So in this case, we only have one answer. Just 0 is our only answer. So this only has one solution. I showed you this in particular because when you get to your assignment, you're going to need to know if a problem has one solution, two solutions, or no solution. In any problem, like the first ones that we did, where you're taking the square root of a number, so like a square root of 16 here, whenever you do that, you're going to get two solutions because you got to put the plus or minus in front of that. However, if you're taking the square root of a negative, you'll get no real solutions. If you're taking the square root of 0, you'll only get one solution. All right, so the assignment that's going to go with these notes, there's two parts. The first part is you're going to do a worksheet that I've posted to Canvas, and I will show you what that looks like there. If you will go to Canvas, let me pull up Canvas here, and you should be accessing all of this through modules, although you can go to assignments as well. So if you're on the module here for this section, you're going to see 10.1 Part A, Solving Quadratics by Square Roots. Actually, no, it's the worksheet right here. 10.1 Part A worksheet. You actually might want to do Excel first. It's a little bit easier. And so if you click here, it'll bring up the worksheet. And you can just click down in the corner there to bring it up. And here are the problems that you'll do. If you want to print it out and do the problems, you can, or you can just write it on notebook paper, will be perfectly fine. And then to turn this in, because we can't actually turn this in so easily, let me go back to where I was here. Let's see, let's close that out. To turn this in, what I want you to do is take a picture of your work and email it to me to get credit. You can just take a picture with your cell phone is fine, or your parent's cell phone, and email it to me. Or if you're using a Chromebook from the school, you can use the document camera there to take a picture and email that to me. If you're having trouble with that, let me know so that I can help you out with that. This assignment will be due on Friday, so please email it to me by then. You also have one other part with the assignment, and that other part that you'll see right here is that you need to do IXL, Algebra 1, BB6. It's solving a quadratic equation using square roots. Now, for that IXL assignment, you will get to some problems. The first one should be pretty simple to solve equations, but then you'll get to some equations like this. How many real solutions does the equation have? So I've got g squared equals 0. If I take the square root of both sides, The square root of 0 is 0. You can put a plus or minus, but there's just one answer. So this one would be one real solution. Okay, this one says how many real solutions does the equation have? F squared minus 9 equals negative 4. So for this one, if I subtracted 9 from both sides, I'd get F squared equals negative 13. And negative 13, I cannot take the square root of, so I'd put no real solution. And I continue on. This one says how many real solutions again? M squared plus 1. When I move the 1 over to the other side, it becomes negative, so that one is no real solution. This one's negative. I'm trying to get one that's that's one.
Can we have an apple for
Let's see. I'm looking for one that's 2. Right here is a good example. It doesn't ask you though. So eventually, if you get one where you're taking the square root of a positive number, you'll get 2 solutions is what that answer will be. So you'll do that IXL as well. That's also due by Friday. So please make sure that you get both of those done. Thank you.